I think Ajay alluded to this when he set the context for this session, that the subject of strategy can be extremely wide, and we all come from our own experiences and our perspectives. So there is no prescription really for how we can design strategy, particularly given the kind of year this has been and what it suggests the next few years are going to be like. But I just have drawn a leaf from our own experiences, within HUF, what the foundation has dealt with over the last few months, and also the kind of ringside view we've had of the sector, through our partners, both observing how they've grappled with issues over the last 6-7 months, and also what we've learned, through our dialogue and our interactions with them. The curse of doing sessions on Zoom is that you will have to bear with a small presentation, but I'm going to try and make it as painless as possible, but get down very quickly more to the kind of questions that you may have as well. And so I think the entire premise is that how do we come out stronger as an outcome of the last few months. And I know that this is a little hard to kind of wrap our heads around, because we're actually struggling with the problem of a single narrative. And the single narrative is that we're talking of an imminent crushing demise of organizations. The words used sometimes are like Armageddon to indicate the intensity and the scale at which organizations are likely to be affected. And the news that we read and what we hear of is also actually suggesting that there's been a large suck of funds in the early part of the year, and that there is very clearly a financial crisis brewing in this year and also the subsequent years. Now, the problem of a singular narrative is that it actually robs us of the opportunity or even the possibility to think that things could be different, right? And it risks end up being a self-fulfilling prophecy that funds will evaporate, therefore programs will suffer, therefore impact will be compromised. If impact is compromised, funder confidence in nonprofits will wane, and so on and so forth. And I think the whole intent really is that how do we come out stronger? Because that is a possibility where we can just sit back and watch, or we can actually think through ways in which we can design for a future which is going to be different and it's going to be challenging. And I want to make a distinction here. This is not about a motivation speech that talks about how every crisis is an opportunity. I think this is a very clear invitation for all of us to pause, reflect, think, and then act. I think we've all gone through a fairly challenging time over the last few months. And while we had adrenaline and surge carrying us forward for the first few months, I think as we start looking at what the next few years are going to look like, we all, deserve to actually sit down and first take a deep breath and start thinking about, is there an alternative? Or is that meteor that is heading towards this sector, is it really, going to crash and be done with most of us? And so I'm just sharing 4 large building blocks of this thinking and this approach, right? The first is to start believing that possibilities other than clear decimation exist. Because if you don't believe that, then all of what we will hear in the rest of this afternoon, or even as we run organizations on a day-to-day basis, will just seem very futile. It's very important to first believe that there could be a path other than what everyone seems to be talking about. The second building block is to actually embrace the true north and drop everything else. I think as organizations have expanded, we've kind of moved into adjacent areas and then in unconnected areas. And maybe this is a time for all of us, foundations and nonprofits alike, to actually sit down and think through, what's really core to what we do, and what is actually a distraction. The third, principle is really about adopting, the approach of a compass and not a map, right? We're all used to our maps, our weekly plans, our fortnightly plans, our quarterly reports, our annual project reports. And guess what happened in 2020, right? That plan that we made for 2020-21 is perhaps hiding in some corner of our of our desktops because it's completely irrelevant, right? What we needed was probably a map, a compass to kind of navigate our way through this period, because a map really didn't serve its purpose. And I think once all of these core blocks are in place, how do we lead with good choices, with real assets, and with culture that glues all of this together? So I'm going to very briefly talk about these four aspects, and then leave it to to questions that you may have. Again, as I said, this is our perspective. This is what we've seen, as the journey of our organizations and our own dialogue and conversations internally. And we're just putting this in the mix here. So the first thing is, how do you believe that possibilities actually exist? Because don't we all know that we're going to be facing a significant crisis on the financial front? That is true. We did an exercise using data for futures, right? And all of them are likely, right? You can have a continued growth path where present trends stay the way they are, and life continues on an upward trajectory after a slight bump and disturbance. The second future is one of collapse, which is a complete breakdown, right? And the way things worked before don't work anymore. The third future is one of discipline, where you're forced to adapt, but you come back to core values and you keep it going on the real heart of what truly matters in your organizations. And the fourth future is one of transformative. It's a transformative future where you actually change the rules of the game, and you completely take on a different track. Now, this is not theoretical. Actually, when we looked at our organizations, it's interesting that across all our entire portfolio, we had organizations that actually mirrored these archetypes. We had a partner who, after the initial, challenges of lockdown, said, you know what, we don't want to change anything as far as our plan is concerned. It's strong, it's robust. It'll actually help us to now cover more ground, and we would rather do that. We really don't want to do a significant change in what we're doing. We had a partner who, with very good intentions, moved into immediate aid and relief, but unfortunately missed out on a very critical window for the cropping season and ended up seeing a complete collapse of their flagship program. We have another partner, who's again working in a state that has had significant lockdowns on a very ambitious program, that cuts across a large number of districts. And then they said, you know what, this was going to be the year of growth, but why don't we just focus on what we can do with our ground presence across our districts and just focus on those. And then we have also had a partner who said, you know what, we worked with you because you said that you could support a program on water and farmers, but at the core, we're an organization that believes in building community agency. And we would like to embed your work in that. We wouldn't just want our work to be all about water. And it's interesting that in the last 5.5 months, we've seen each of these archetypes play themselves out. Yeah. Now, what this has meant is, and particularly for organizations that have taken the discipline or the transformative path, is that they very quickly recognized what was their true north. And this is a difficult question to grapple with. Why do you do what you do, right? It's not about the what, right? It's not about the activities. It's not about the program interventions. But at the core of your institution's DNA, why do you do what you do? And if you close down tomorrow, why would you be missed and by whom? Now, interestingly, when you do this question with organizations, very clearly the entire anchor of programs and the reason why organizations set up in the first place was to serve communities, right? And interestingly, they're very clear that their funders will not miss them and the government may not miss them, but the communities are definitely going to miss them, and for very, very specific reasons. And it's really important maybe to come back to this, true north and say, why, as an organization, do we do what we do, right? And why would we be missed if we don't exist, right? Once the core of the organization and what you do and why you do that becomes clear, it's also important to not cage it down into like definitive prescriptive plans, right? And this is really the difference between maps that we love so much, our frameworks and our pathways and are long drawn Gantt charts which are fixed. They're about discipline, they're about control, they're about compliance, they're about adherence, they're also about variances and deviations, right? And guess what? None of that matters in a year like this, right? But a compass is a vision of the destination. And there are different ways of getting there. And you have the capacity to improvise when you face an obstacle. And it means that you empower people with the tools to find their way to that destination. I'd like to just share an example. Again, these are examples from our programs, right? A partner that wanted to do 100 workshops with 1,000 farmers in 50 villages for arhar cultivation found themselves in a peculiar situation. Why? Because the rain gods were also in a funk this year. And, we didn't actually, take into account that if it rains continuously for a large number of days, this entire crop is going to be unviable, right? Now, the entire program had been based on a premise that we will be growing a particular crop, right? But as I said, the gods had different plans, as they've clearly shown for this year. And so this just did not work. And so we had to scramble, literally when the season had, was towards its tail end, for prep work and figure out a different, route. But interestingly, if you looked at the compass approach, they said, what, we want to create a safety net for our communities. We want to secure our farmers from, future shocks in finance and environmental risks. Now, when you put your goal or your purpose like that, there are different ways of doing it. And if rains decide to be, abundant, you know what to do. If it's a scarce rainfall year, you know what to do. If it's a normal rainfall year, you know what to do. And I think this kind of like agility and dynamism in design is something that we've learned will now be, par for the course, because just that map with coordinates and, 200 meters ahead, take a right, unfortunately just does not work. It's also about making a couple of hard choices, right? And for all those of you who are, who are aware of Marie Kondo's work, we've kind of taken a leaf. I know the work, has both, fans and detractors. But I think what works in that approach is that if you put down all that you do as an organization, what would you discard first? And only then start looking at a resting place for all the other things that you do as an organization. I think when we talk about a conversation on core and distraction or core and peripheral work, we tend to first and foremost seize on what we cannot live without or do without. But I think the interesting thing about taking Marie Kondo's approach that she proposes for how you can clean up your homes and your cupboards and your life and your stationery and all of that is that you first get rid of what is a clear distraction. Right? And I think that again this is very hard for organizations to do. But if you know what your true north is, right, sometimes this becomes a lot easier because it's very evident, what are the areas that you really need to, that you can do without. And because your communities would not miss you if you kind of skipped out on those. The other choices really in terms of relief, continuity, and growth. Can you do it all? Right? And a lot of organizations face this really hard choice this year. And the way to look at it is, can you segment and segregate HR and financial capacity for relief work, to continue existing programs, and to invest in growth for the future, right? If you can do all three, by all means, go out with, with your guns blazing on all fronts. But if you can't, then make an informed call, right? We've seen instances of a lot of organizations that, again, with very good, meaning, very, very, very well-intentioned efforts, wanted to support, what they saw as a clear humanitarian crisis, but it came at the cost of actually ensuring that their core programs, which would actually support medium-term recovery for communities, got affected instead. And then this is a challenging part, right? And we used to often wonder, like, why do you have to look at programs in 3 years or 5 years or 2 years or 7 years? Because the notion of time for a community is very different. For a farmer, it's one cropping season. If you don't deliver impact, they're not going to wait for you to sort yourself out. Right? For a pregnant woman, it's 9 months, right? For a community that's grappling with the water crisis, it's one monsoon, right? And so instead of looking at, impact growing over a period of time, can we actually look at a way where we prioritize speed over perfection and prototype our response to situations basis the notion of time for the communities we want to serve, right? And we've seen this play out this year as well, because a lot of organizations were able to respond very, very rapidly because there were people who were simply walking back home, right? And you couldn't say, let me put a plan in place, get it approved, and then we will respond, right? I think that kind of like agility and speed of response is actually going to be very critical as we start building what our organizations could be over the course of the next few years. And this is again an interesting aspect that we see very few organizations focusing on. This is something that businesses look at, both financial and non-financial. But the thinking around assets and what you're building as assets as organizations is very important. And why we say that is because activities don't qualify as an asset, right? An asset is something which is going to have longevity beyond you, right? It will continue to serve and give results even after you've paused, investing in it. And some examples that we have seen of effective assets that organizations have built are community agency, where you've built very, very strong, community institutions that now have the capacity to engage with the state, on issues, pertaining to their rights and their entitlements. Again, networks, the reason why a lot of organizations were able to respond effectively is because they tapped into their, relationships with government, their relationships with local communities, their relationships with, with people on the ground, right? And those are again assets that a lot of organizations tend to undermine. Tools, again, in the last few months, we've seen organizations respond with, digital solutions around surveys, SMS and IVR enabled, content, access to people who could not show up for meetings, data systems which have also been built up. And we feel that this digital shift in the sector is again a thing which will hold us, in good stead. But again, these are tools that can actually transcend the boundary of a particular program or project. And last but not the least, right? What are your relationships with your funders? Are these transactional relationships or are these collegial relationships? Are these relationships that are defined by program management? Or are you actually truly together as you're trying to find solutions to problems that are very hard and challenging? And it's often good to sit back and say, what do we have as assets in our organization? Because these are the kind of building blocks that actually serve organizations very well, both in normal times as well as when things get really rough and patchy. And then we come to culture, right? And I'm going to go beyond values and and practices and processes, but talk about maybe just three things, right? One is that we've got to get past this desire to have budgets growing year on year. There is a certain agility and a certain speed of response and a certain sense of empowerment that we've seen amongst small grassroots organizations. And it's really important to imbibe that DNA and not just chase growth for the sake of growth. I think the other piece that we've seen is that as education, as access to education has grown in rural India, the old model where you needed to send professionals from the city to work in communities, maybe due for a change. And across our programs, we're seeing that when you build professionals from within the community, there are significant, results and outcomes far beyond what you would have anticipated in an original program design. And so we really need to think about how we're transitioning, capability with people who are in our communities and at the first mile. And I think last but not the least, and I alluded to this as well in terms of the power of collaboratives. This is our view that the unit of one grant, one grantee, one program will be actually at a stage where it's giving diminishing returns. We need to design for partnerships. The transformative, path have actually taken a lot of support of external partners. And today we see ourselves designing, for partnerships and not really designing for programs. And this has been a significant shift. But what ends up happening is that you end up doing more, with far less as well. So when we look at the possibilities for the future, as we look at how we can design, I think the only thing to probably think through is that these possibilities exist. While the dominant narrative continues to be one of, there's a meteor coming our way, and we're all bracing for impact. I think what's relevant and what makes today's session relevant is that the tools to invent, an alternative future also exist. And I'm really hoping that you enjoy the sessions that have been planned by Arjun and the Arthan team, because I think we need a lot more thinking and doing around alternatives that don't have to do with, this is all going to end.